Morning. So we are seeing much as expected. If you read when the project for a new American century documents came out, you knew that this was going to happen. They're going to make a false flag claim against Russia. And first, before going after Russia, they're going to try to topple all the Russian allied countries. And those are countries like Venezuela, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, and so on and so forth. And they released these documents in 2000, and they said that they plan to make a new American century where America is the only power in the world, not just the sole superpower, but effectively a hyperpower in that they control the entire planet. And it was released by the neoconservatives for the most part. And they pretty openly said that they are gonna do false flag attacks and they're gonna blame them on terrorists and groups like that and start to get rights for the US to invade other countries. In fact, here is a good link. Was you can basically read this is keeping in mind that this is Wikipedia, so you might want to do a thing of your searches. Further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to not be a long one, absent some catastrophic and is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. If I was a let's say conspiracy-minded person, I would be very worried about this thing. But essentially, it was in no way new that US is gonna do tonkin, 9/11, etc. style false flag attacks. And it's gonna be relatively bad because they are looking to make a world imperium. Now, what they said they were planning to do has basically come to pass. The Russians and the Chinese have been driven into a geopolitical corner, and it's starting to look like they're the bad guys when they respond. And in this particular debate, nobody is the good guy or the bad guy. But when one bad guy makes the other bad guy look like a very bad guy, then that is all you need to know. So it's looking like the US will do a false flag attack. We could blame it on the Russians, but at the moment, it is not in the geopolitical interests of Russia to play this false flag into an attack. And one of the things I found, which was to me very interesting, was that the Western Catholic New Year, when we are weakest, when our civilians are at home, when our military is at its lowest point because of all the Christmas celebrations, happens around December. And if somebody wanted to attack the West in a surprise attack, it would probably be around December. This has been the historic norm, if you will. And the Eastern, or in this case, the Orthodox, the Russian calendar New Year and Christmas are around January to February, basically. So If they wanted to attack us when we were weak, they would do it in December. If we wanted to attack them when they're weak, we'd do it around January, February. So that's why it's starting to look like to me that this might be the West's thing. So I don't know. I don't want to trust either side. They both seem like they've truly lost their marbles and have no idea of what is going on. They both seem mentally ill to me. They're playing a game with a country that has 4 to 5,000 nuclear weapons, Russians with the US and the US with the Russians. They're stating red lines beyond which they cannot let the opponent expand, such as US saying they cannot let Russian nuclear missiles into Cuba, and the Russians saying they cannot let American nuclear missiles into Ukraine. And both sides are ignoring each other's red lines, so they're not looking likely to back down. So this is basically the 2012 world change, which we predicted. But I'm gonna watch some news and I'm gonna see what the world is saying. This is from Crocs.
Russia has already pre-positioned a group of operatives to conduct a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine.
Indicates that Russia is already working actively to create a pretext for a potential invasion.
Keep in mind, as a Finn, I know all about Russia creating pretexts due to the Mainila shots, but those were 80 to 100 years ago, and the West's equivalent was 20 years ago. This kind of strategic escalation from a purely Eastern standpoint makes no sense, because no matter how many embargoes the West imposes, the Eastern economic growth is going to overtake the West in a matter of years. So from their point of view, just waiting until the West is economically down.
Warfare and in using explosives to carry out acts of sabotage against Russia's own proxy forces.
I hope you guys can read body language. Y'all remember when we talking about the 9/11 as a false flag was called a conspiracy theory? No, it's the same guy saying the opponent is doing a false flag, and supposedly it's no longer a conspiracy theory.
We do have information that indicates that Russia is already working actively to create a pretext for a potential invasion, for a move on Ukraine. In fact, we have information that they pre-positioned a group of operatives to conduct what we call a false flag operation, an operation designed to look like an attack on them or their people or Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, again as an excuse to go in.
And we've seen this before. We saw this before leading up to 2014, just to note, including through sabotage activities and information operations by accusing Ukraine of preparing an imminent attack against Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. And the Russian military plans to begin these activities several weeks before a military invasion, which could begin between mid-January and mid-February. Again, we saw this playbook before, including the widespread effort to push out misinformation, not just in Eastern Europe, but around the global community.
Like we did with various US operations that they were planning. And we were told that we're insane because we claimed that we stopped them by talking about them.
We are concerned that the Russian government is preparing for an invasion in Ukraine that may result in widespread human rights violations and war crimes should diplomacy fail to meet their objectives.
Перше, дискредитація країни. Тобто хтось показує, що наша країна не захищена в плані інформаційної безпеки. Для кого це потрібно?
That last statement said all that needed be said. These can also be false flag attacks done by Russia's enemies. And this is the real point. What would US do? Would it sink the Russian things? So why not shoot down US airplanes in Ukraine?
If Russia were to move in that direction, we would deal with it decisively. Russia has announced the possibility of a military deployment to Cuba and Venezuela if talks with the West on Ukraine fail to go their way, while warning the latest discussions with NATO were hitting a dead end. The Biden administration responded to threats from Russian officials, vowing a decisive response if it sees any evidence that the threat is real. In an apparent attempt to up the ante with the Biden administration, Sergei Ryabkov, who led Russia's delegation in a meeting with the US, told Russian television he could neither confirm nor exclude sending military assets to Cuba and Venezuela if talks fail. Speaking in an interview with a Russian TV, Ryabkov noted that it all depends on the action by our US counterparts, pointing to Russian President Vladimir Putin's warning that Moscow could take military technical measures if the US provokes the Kremlin and turns up military pressure on it. While voicing concern that NATO could potentially use Ukrainian territory for the deployment of missiles capable of reaching Moscow in just 5 minutes, Putin noted that Russian warships armed with the latest Zircon hypersonic cruise missile would give Russia a similar capability if deployed in neutral waters. Zircon, which Putin said flies at 9 times the speed of sound to a range of more than 1,000 kilometers, is hard to intercept and could be fitted with conventional or nuclear warheads. It's set to be commissioned by the Russian Navy later this year and installed aboard its frigates and submarines. At the end of a week of diplomacy that appears to have produced no progress, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said the U.S. had intelligence that Russia was preparing to fabricate claims of an imminent Ukrainian attack on Russian forces as a pretext for invasion. He said, "We saw this playbook in 2014. They are preparing this playbook again." Sullivan said that the administration would share more of the intelligence in the following 24 hours. Sullivan said no dates had been set for any further talks, but added, "We're in communication with the Russians and we'll see what comes next." Asked about Russian officials' suggestion of Russian deployments in Cuba or Venezuela, Jake Sullivan would not respond to bluster.
There are no dates set for any more talks. We have to consult with allies and partners first. We're in communication with the Russians and we'll see what comes next.
Jay, could you address the Deputy Foreign Minister's comments to Iraq about suggesting that the U.S. that Russia should deploy forces or rule out deploying forces in Latin America? Is that something that the U.S. is concerned about? Is that something that came up in the discussions?
I'm not going to respond to bluster in the public commentary that wasn't raised in the discussions at the Strategic Stability Dialogue. If Russia were to move in that direction, we would move decisively.
Tensions have been rising between Washington and Moscow since December, when Russia began amassing tens of thousands of troops on its border with Ukraine. Russian officials, including President Vladimir Putin, have not ruled out an invasion. Talks have taken place among Russian, American, European, and NATO officials over the past 3 days across Europe, but officials have not reported any breakthroughs. Sullivan said that the Russian diplomats had not mentioned the prospect of military deployments in Cuba or Venezuela during their meetings. Ryabkov last month compared the current tensions over Ukraine with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union deployed missiles to Cuba and the US imposed a naval blockade around the island. That crisis ended after then US President John F. Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed that Moscow would withdraw its missiles in exchange for Washington's pledge not to invade Cuba and the removal of US missiles from Turkey. Some Cuban exiles have been closely watching the Biden administration's standoff with Russia and China, with the hopes that a new geopolitical realignment would entice the Biden administration to claim Cuba in the US circle of influence and more actively seek regime change on the island. Ryabkov's comments could add to the speculation that the Caribbean island could again become entangled in a replay of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The governments of Cuba and Venezuela have not publicly responded to the comments. The Cuban embassy in Washington did not immediately respond to a request for comment. As tensions grew between Havana and Washington during the Trump administration, Russia has become closer to the communist island, approving loans and increasing military cooperation. A senior-level official of the Russian Ministry of Defense, quoted by the U.S. Cuba Trade and Economic Council, estimated that a robust presence in Cuba would bring millions in spending for infrastructure upgrades. A Russian official estimated that the economic impact of having up to 2,500 Russian civilian and military forces in Cuba could bring $100 million annually to the Cuban government. Russia Russia could also pay an additional fee to Cuban authorities, as it did in the past for hosting the Ludes intelligence listening post near Havana. In December 2018, Russia briefly dispatched a pair of its nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela in a show of support for Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro amid Western pressure. Russia also increased its economic involvement in the oil sector in Venezuela, helping the country skirt U.S. sanctions. According to U.S. officials at the time, Russia also played a role in convincing Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro to stay in power when the opposition attempted to flip top military leaders in 2019. Venezuela's interim government led by Juan Guaido, which the United States recognizes as the country's legitimate authority, rejected Ryabkov's comments in categorical terms. The fact that a high-ranking official of that country has insinuated an action of this scale represents an absolute transgression to national sovereignty and the integrity of our territory, the interim government said in a statement. Venezuela cannot be used as a pawn in a geopolitical game between the powers of the world. In Moscow, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said there could be a complete rupture in US-Russian relations if proposed sanctions targeting the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, and other top civilian and military leaders were adopted. Senate Democrats have also proposed targeting leading Russian financial institutions if Moscow sends troops into Ukraine. Peskov criticized the proposals as an attempt to up the pressure on Moscow during the talks, saying it wouldn't work. He said it concerns sanctions, which, taking into account the inevitable adequate response, effectively amount to an initiative to rupture relations. Russian foreign
Finnish flag. What am I seeing here? Can't get a close-up view if these are Finnish officials. It's probably some kind of discussion that I don't know about.
Amount to an initiative to rupture relations. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also denounced the proposed sanctions as a reflection of US arrogance, adding that Moscow expects a written response to its demands from the US and NATO next week in order to mull further steps. Peskov rebuffed the West's calls for Russia to help de-escalate tensions by pulling back troops from areas near Ukraine, noting that the country is free to move them wherever it wants on its own territory. He said, "It's hardly possible for NATO to dictate to us where we should move our armed forces on Russian territory. There will be no deficit of a political will to continue the negotiations." Polish Foreign Minister Zbigniew Rau, who assumed the position of the OSCE chairman in office, noted in his opening speech that the risk of war in the OSCE area is now greater than ever before in the last 30 years. He said, "For several weeks, we have been faced with the possibility of a major military escalation in Eastern Europe." On the other side, NATO said it was willing to talk to Russia about arms control and missile deployments to avert the risk of war in Europe, but Moscow said the situation was very dangerous and the way forward was unclear. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said the alliance was willing to hold arms talks but would not allow Moscow to veto Ukraine's ambition to join NATO one day, a core demand on which Russia says it will not yield. He said, "There is a real risk for new armed conflict in Europe." He also said, "Ukraine is a valued and long-standing partner to NATO. We just addressed the evolving situation in and around Ukraine. Russia's military buildup continues, with tens of thousands of combat-ready troops, armed with heavy capabilities. Recently, NATO foreign ministers called again on Russia to remove its forces from Ukraine and from Ukraine's borders, demonstrate transparency, and de-escalate. Any further aggression against Ukraine would come at a high political and economic price." Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko said Moscow was ready to talk about weapons deployment and verification measures, but would not allow its proposals to be cherry-picked. At a lengthy news conference, Grushko said Russia could not take seriously NATO's claim to be a defensive alliance that posed no threat to it, and said it would respond symmetrically to any attempt to contain or intimidate it. He said, "If there is a search for vulnerabilities in the Russian defense system, then there will also be a search for vulnerabilities in NATO." Russia denies planning to invade Ukraine, but says it needs a series of guarantees for its own security, including a halt to further NATO expansion and a withdrawal of alliance forces from Central and Eastern European nations that joined it after 1997. Consequently, Russia has strongly repeated its demand that NATO will not expand eastwards, despite the rejection of that by the military alliance amid a Russian troop buildup near Ukraine. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov described Moscow's demands that NATO will neither expand nor deploy forces to Ukraine and other ex-Soviet nations as essential for the progress of diplomatic efforts to defuse soaring tensions over Ukraine. He argued that the deployment of NATO forces and weapons near Russia's borders poses a security challenge that must be addressed immediately. It is time to share your opinion. Can Russia deploy troops to Cuba and Venezuela?
Onko ideat ja aika kortilla? Ruokaboksi on palvelu, joka helpottaa kiireistä arkea. Saat monipuolisen arkiruuan reseptit ja raaka-aineet suoraan kotiin. Helppo kuin ruokaboksi.
The United States has accused Russia of sending saboteurs trained in explosives to stage a pretext to invade Ukraine. Now, the allegations mark a striking new escalation in tensions over Ukraine. U.S. says it is concerned that Russia is preparing for an invasion against Ukraine. Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby told reporters that U.S. has information that Russia has pre-positioned a group of operatives to conduct what is being called a false flag operation. The U.S., Europe, allies, and Russia held talks this week, which ended in a stalemate. So far, there are no plans to meet again and address Russia's deployment of tens of thousands of troops along the border. A cyber attack against Ukraine has further inflamed tensions.
Look, we've certainly seen this playbook before, particularly in 2014 with their illegal annexation, occupation of Crimea. Without getting into too much detail, we do have information that indicates that Russia is already working actively to create a pretext for a potential invasion, for a move on Ukraine. In fact, we have information that they pre-positioned a group of operatives to conduct what we call a false flag operation, an operation designed to look like an attack on them or their or Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, again as an excuse to go in.
U.S. President Joe Biden has warned his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, of severe economic consequences if it launches an invasion against Ukraine. Russia has stationed artillery, tens of thousands of troops near the Ukrainian border. Russia has denied plans to invade Ukraine and dismissed statements made by U.S. by calling them unfounded. And beyond correspondent Susan Tehrani has sent us this report from New York for more of this.
While the Biden administration accused Moscow on Friday of sending operatives into Ukraine to stage an incident that would then provide Russian President Vladimir Putin with an excuse to invade part or all of that country, the White House did not provide any details of the evidence to back its charge, although one U.S. official did vaguely say that those allegations were based on, quote, a mix of intercepted communications and observations of the movement of people. Also, Pentagon spokesman John Kirby, when asked by reporters, said that the intelligence regarding this operation was, quote unquote, very incredible. The U.S., by releasing this statement, hopes that by exposing this alleged operation, it would prevent a potential attack. However, by not providing the evidence that it is charging, some of which it has provided to allies and key members of Congress, it is perhaps opening up itself to charges made by Russia that it has either fabricated evidence or it has faulty intelligence. That's something that experts and analysts are concerned about. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION. Roll this one.
Staying on with the row unfolding between Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine was hit by a cyber attack in which a warning was flashed across government websites. In the latest, Russia says it has dismantled the prominent hacking group called Rebel. It carried out a high-profile attack last year on U.S. software firm Kaseya. The step comes after Washington made a request. The arrests were a rare demonstration of collaboration between U.S. and Russia. This comes at a time when tensions run at an all-time high. The local news channel aired footage of agents raiding homes and arresting people, taking them to the floor and seizing large piles of dollars. The group members have been charged and could face up to 7 years in prison. The announcement comes few hours after the Ukrainian government websites were hit by hackers. A warning posted in Ukrainian said, and I quote, "All information about you has become public. Be afraid and expect worse. It's your past, present, and future." Ukraine linked the cyber attack to Russia. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin held a summit in June last year. Cybersecurity was one of the main issues on the agenda. The US and its allies have offered Ukraine support. Listen in.
The United States and our allies and partners are concerned about this cyber attack, and the president has been briefed. We are also in touch with the Ukrainians and have offered our support as Ukraine investigates the impact and nature and recovers from the incidents. We don't have attribution at this time, and I can't point to any more specifics. I know the Ukrainians also announced and conveyed that they got their systems up and running pretty quickly and that personal data was not accessed. We will continue to, of course, work with them and assess any additional impacts.
A top Ukrainian security official says that hackers appear to have used the software administration rights of a third-party company that developed the sites. Now, the Deputy Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council has also said that Ukraine was working to establish who obtained such access, whether it was done externally or through an insider. Other experts in Ukraine believe that hackers could be setting the stage for more serious cyber attacks that would disrupt the lives of ordinary Ukrainians. Intrusions by hackers in hospitals, power utility companies, and the financial systems were a rare phenomenon. However, organized cyber criminals have gone after institutions aggressively in the past 2 years.
4 years. It's a large scale since almost 70 ministers have been affected and their websites have been defaced.
Russia has rejected hacking allegations leveled by Ukraine and other countries over the years.
Oh, this is 3 days ago. Now for the Arab view.
After a week of negotiation in 3 European cities, there are no signs of any diplomatic breakthrough, and a warning from the White House that the Ukraine crisis will escalate even further, with a claim that Russia is planning to create a pretext for an invasion.
We have information that indicates Russia has already pre-positioned a group of operatives to conduct a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine. The operatives are trained in urban warfare and in using explosives to carry out acts of sabotage against Russia's own proxy forces.
Everybody,
The allegation was echoed by the U.S. Defense Department.
we already have, in addition, indications that Russian influence actors are already starting. They're already starting to fabricate Ukrainian provocations that in both state and social media to again try to justify in advance some sort of pretext for incursion.
Claims, too, that Russia was behind a cyber attack on Ukrainian government websites that shut them down for a period of time. The words, "be afraid and fear the worst," were also projected on several official sites. At a scheduled annual news conference, the Russian foreign minister dismissed the allegations and maintained that it was the US and its allies that were stalling the diplomatic process by not responding to Russia's demand that NATO membership for Ukraine be taken off the table.
As you say, we are waiting for the written reaction. We have reasons to believe that our partners have understood the necessity to react quickly, precisely, and on paper, and they have understood that we are not going to wait forever. But of course, there are plans to drag it on and on.
The US Senate is continuing to debate imposing sanctions on Russia, and while there's bipartisan agreement on the need for strong action, there's disagreement about the details.
The bill is not passed.
Democrats rejected a proposal by Republican Senator Ted Cruz to sanction a gas pipeline from Russia to Germany.
Probably every single one of us in this chamber agrees that the United States must be strong in confronting Putin and his destabilizing tactics in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine. But as my colleagues made clear this morning, Senator Cruz's bill, in our opinion, is the wrong answer at this time to deter President Putin's aggression.
The White House insists that sanctions against Russia should not impact on allies like Germany, walking a tightrope as it attempts to define what form sanctions should take. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
I can only say that the nuclear power plant that Finland was building for like 20 fucking years and got completed like a month ago was in the fucking nick of time. Because if you guys do end up even in a minor scuffle, I'm not talking about like Fallout level end of the world scuffles, I'm talking about a minor like scuffle. The oil and gas embargo is going to go through as one of the first things, and the price of Europe is going to fucking skyrocket for anything that relates to warming up. And the Europeans at the same time are shutting down most of their coal and nuclear because, oh god, nuclear! And Finland now has the capability to produce maybe half of its domestic energy, maybe 75%, I'm not sure, with like nuclear power, just kind of like France or Japan, which are both going with, oh, we can't use nuclear because big boom boom. And then we look at how many people actually die from the radiation that is released by burning coal or burning natural gas. And they're like, oh, but it no look so bad. It look bad when big thing of boom boom. And we're like, yeah. We're not stopping the use of fertilizers because of the Bhopal, basically fertilizer plant explosion that killed like something like 20 fucking thousand people or something, and we shouldn't be stopping nuclear because a couple of reactors here and there would blow up. We should keep using it because it's the only fucking way to get the CO2 down, which I know you guys don't believe is a problem. I know you think like it's gonna warm up 1 degree, but you guys are fucking idiots. You're lunatics if you think that's what's gonna happen. By the time you notice that it is permanently warmer, if you stop CO2 at that point, the temperature is going to keep rising for at least 20 years at the rate that it was rising before. It's not going to go like you stop CO2 and warming stops. That's not how it works. It's not going to overcook the planet, and we're not going to see the oceans evaporate away and stuff like that, because there's a balancing system on the planet. When it gets more heat, the life that enjoys heat is going to expand and so on. It's the Daisy World theory. But we are going to see such a fucking level of shit because these guys are afraid of nuclear power and renewables, and the investments these countries are doing into renewables are absolutely lacking. They have no idea how much they need to impress into it or put into it. And at the same time, they're already cutting the use of coal and nuclear while they're experiencing a shortage of gas and energy and higher prices for it. So the one thing keeping Europe warm during this winter is Russian gas. So if you fuck with the gas supply, you can get the super rich enough gas with tankers across the America from the American natural gas fields. You can do that. You'll get the super rich off. But the vast majority of Europeans will suffer a shit ton of problems from that. And that isn't because we are importing Russian gas. That's because we are stopping the production of nuclear too early. Nuclear should be stopped, but not while we're trying to contain CO2. In fact, after 2,000 nuclear explosions on the surface of this planet, which is what you did during the entire Cold War, one nuclear generator blowing up every 20 years is not that bad. I mean, you don't want to fucking play around with it, but it's not the end of the world. Now, putting a nuclear reactor next to your capital in a way where if it blows up, your entire capital is going to be fucked like Japan did. That may not be what you want to do. But putting them in places where there's enough land around so that if they do actually blow up, it won't contaminate anything but a forest where the only reaction will be that the worms are 10% larger, essentially. That's like what you ought to do. But if you fuck with the natural gas supplies during a cold winter where you're already at an energy shortage, you're going to experience the Russian winter in your homeland. You don't even have to go to Russia for that one. And it's not going to be reducing the household temperatures by 5 degrees Celsius. It's not going to be that if you can't get the Russian gas into Europe. I mean, I'm thankful, despite not liking the nuclear reactor that Finland built, that it's been built, that we literally can buy uranium and wait 5 years for buying the next supply of uranium and have one fairly small cargo container ship transport it to Finland, take out the waste, or we can in fact even bury the waste, because we're one of the very few countries that have a final nuclear waste nuclear waste site where we are planning it to be one of those 100,000 year sites instead of the temporary containment sites that most people are building. So we're not really worried about the natural gas thing, but that is because we know that when these two, let's say, parent figures start arguing, the children are going to be left homeless in the street without anything. We know what it's like. You cannot rely on the Russians and you cannot rely on the West. When things become tough, they will abuse you. They are abusive people in abusive systems. You can when things are good, when they're happy, when nobody has a problem, then you can do trades with them, you can do deals with them. But the reality is that if things go south, they will not help you, because that is what abusive parents do. And I know enough about abusive parents to see one when I see one. And I'm seeing two. I'm seeing the demented man who thinks that the kids these days are fucking up the world, and is seeing the fucking up of the world by being done by the other parent. They are being do this, or it's that guy influencing society, instead of the youth picking that one because they more associate with him. They think they are changing because of propaganda. They're too stupid to realize that it's just the propaganda of the opposition, and our side is the good one. And then they go around, children hair. And then they go like, but can't you see I'm one of your homies? And us guys in the anime community go, go fuck yourself, old man. Go fuck yourself. And then we're looking at Russia, which is basically like run by a biker, like a literal biker gang. And we're like, oi. I mean, oi. And Europe is in the middle going like, but if we support one abusive parent, when they kick out the other one, they'll be good to us. And we're like, you're not gonna get a good result by picking one abusive parent over the other. You're not gonna get a good result. You'll get a bad result. You'll get a very bad result. In fact, the reality of this situation is that it's first one parent doing bad shit, the children opposing it and turning to the other parent, and then the other parent going and doing the same thing. It's the good cop, bad cop thing, and they're trying to get us all into one camp so they can decide who is the top dog and then leave the planet in, like, I wouldn't say monarchy, but you could basically say monarchy. And they aren't really interested in their countries. I'm not gonna say they're not running their countries with interest or like with focus and effort and such. And I'm not going to say that, because most of these guys are actually trying to do that. But their main interest isn't in running their country. It's in running the planet. It's in running everything. And they are more interested in getting somebody to run the planet than being good at running their own thing. And that is what I'm seeing. And speaking as somebody who's been in the planetary governor stage, these guys have no idea what they're looking for. They have no idea. They cannot tolerate that level of loneliness. They have no conceptual understanding of what they're after, in my opinion. So long story short, we have two abusive parents fighting in front of their children and trying to get the children to align with them. Both are doing the very same criminal acts, and they're doing them in sequence. They're seeing, if I do this, you guys align with the other side. If they do this, do you align with my side? And they're playing what amounts to a good cop, bad cop thing. They're filtering the middle mass with like a thing to see what like remains. They're doing, I don't know what it's called, but gold on a plate and going back and forth in water until only the gold remains. And it's two abusive parents fighting in front of their children. That's all I'm gonna say. Looks so fucking bad. they were, let's say, healthy people, they'd look at what they're doing to cause the situation and change it internally to change the opposition. Has Expanse gotten the 6th season? So I need to watch it. It's a very interesting show. It does quite a lot to paint the modern world in a different light. You think? The game looked good on paper, but the OS is absolutely horrific. It's unbelievably bad. How can a law be banned in war? Huh? That's weird. Weirdly put. It's true though, but it's weirdly put. What was it in Latin? Inter arma and in silent leges. That was the wording. We're also, by the way, approaching the end of the Madagascar gameplay. We're almost at the first satellite launch. It took 10 years and not 20 years. I doubt that I'm going to continue it after the first 10 years because it's good enough. And the next step is something that I don't feel like I'm the best candidate for. It's relatively easy growing the GDP while growing the services while also being in a position to raise taxes. But after you get to a certain point, you notice that there's a lot of budgetary items that you really don't need to pay for, and going through every item individually and carefully and picking out what you need to pay and what you actually don't need to pay and what is actually good is the kind of work that I'm not an expert in. I can prove a proof of concept by showing that increasing the GDP while increasing taxation and services is theoretically possible. I mean, I can do that and show you how you would do things like reduce the unemployment by changing how the taxes and fundings and such are done. But when it comes to the period after the first adjustment, when you make everything be fully funded and it comes down to is it 5% GDP growth, or if we lower these things, is it 5.2% GDP growth? Is not where I'm an expert. I'm an expert in showing basically that you can indeed, while growing an economy, supply people with all the services you could ever require. But people aren't going to go for that. There is a degree of poverty that they'd like to avoid by getting a higher and faster GDP growth by taking the most inefficient budgetary items and taking them out. But that requires the kind of expertise and ministries that I don't have access to. So realistically speaking, we are probably going to see maybe a year or two more of the in-game control, and then I'm probably gonna resign. Thinking until we see if the first launch is successful. Then we have done as we promised, which is to take basically either a third world poor nation or a post-nuclear apocalypse nation into the space age. We were told it would take 50 years, but with our policy it took 10. So that's what we're seeing. Yep. Assuming there's a US to rule by the time there's the next election. I wonder if this situation goes hot, which country is going to be the first to use nuclear weapons. I'm going to check in with the Ukrainian and see if there's anything weird going on. Doubt there is, but you never know. Morning. I'm hearing some worry about the present situation in the music. Hope the children can wisely guide us out of this fucking mess that us adults get getting ourselves into. Still in the same camp. So that's about it. Still hoping that what you might call the gray civilization does something to prevent this, but not having my hopes up. Looks like stupidity has gripped the planet. Literally. So in my personal news, like I said, I think we're almost done with the Madagascar model, almost done. We predicted it would take 20 years from, let's say, fallout coming out of the vault type scenario to get in the space age. But it looks like 10 if you actually do foreign technology exchange instead of just like trying domestically to build it. And I'm assuming that if somebody survives the nuclear war, then more than one nation will survive. And like the tech exchange might be different, but the basic concept might be there. So I'm looking at 10 years into space age, and the first satellite launch is gonna be, if it fails, then we're gonna do another in a matter of months, but I'm gonna see it happen. I'm gonna wait a few days to a few weeks, maybe even a month after the satellite launch to call it a day. But we next need a ministerial or government who can trim the budget that we massively increased to find the programs that aren't worth their money. For example, I'm not sure that Madagascar really requires a volcano insurance. That is the level of paying for everything that you can conceivably pay for. But that is not my thing. My thing is to show how we can expand by high taxes and high government funding at a perhaps 5 to 10% ratio year to year, and that I've been managing to produce consecutive years, year after year. And I've been able to do it across 3 simulators now, and at that point we're talking about the kind of results that I'd want to get peer reviewed, and that's not something I can do on my own. So the longer I do it manually, the harder it is for somebody else to go through the material and see the key points and do a peer review on them. If it's been running for 20 real years, then somebody would have to go through 20 years of records to find the key points, and that's not doable. If it's a smallish project like this, where the main argument is simple: increase the value added tax and reduce the rest, and start paying for functions that your people actually need. And that's about it. Increase tourism, because tourists pay for the goods as well, which is because of your high value added tax, reasonably generative of government income. And because of the fact that you start off with a most likely poor nation if you're going to do this reform, the value-added tax increase is going to cause a increase in the value of your goods and the cost of your goods, but not so much that it would impact tourism. It will impact your domestic buying power, and to counter that, you need to either have good government-funded programs or tax relief for the poorest, because they're going to be hardest hit by the rise of prices. And I basically proved this. So it's getting close to the time when I've done what I set out to do. I've proven most of these things. There are some that I could still continue to push, but I think this might be a healthy time to let others do the pushing. It might have an influence on the world stage. I don't know. If it has a calming influence, I'll be very happy, because this is very hard, very time-consuming work. So it being over calming people might be a very nice thing to do. But that is about the size of it. I think we're looking at maybe a month or two of real time until the simulator is complete. Then people can get the results and have them studied themselves and see what it looks like. And it might influence the global economy in an unpredictable way, but the influencing of the global economy is not the purview of the rich. It is the purview of all of us. So we will have to deal with it. And I hope people can retain their cool. As far as I can see, I'm not privy to all the information that the Russian government has, but as far as I can see, what the troops in the border are doing is scanning. It's when you see a brain and you need to make a model of that brain, you make the neuronal connections on your side of the border opposite to the area where that brain is. And you see this neuron communicates with these neurons through this type of connection, and you make a manual copy of it, and through that build a structure of replicating the brain that you see. It's a form of cloning, and it's done to make sure that if the situation does in fact explode, you have your own side which you can use, and you can withdraw from scanning, if you will. That's what I think it is, but I don't know. I'm not privy to all the information. In my opinion, if this is related to the fact that I basically hijacked a couple of world economies, then it should calm in about a month. But if I am truly large enough to cause this kind of disturbance to the world market by playing a couple of simulators and hanging out with a couple of people, then there are other things we need to look at this besides just tensions, because then there is a very realistic chance that if that is the case, I am sitting on such a massive pile of wealth that I don't know about, that getting it to the world market might be akin to the don't look up scenario of getting the meteorite successfully down. But if that is the case, then the kinds of work we have to do is on a scale of its own and may not be suited for public immediate transmission because of the echoes of it. I don't think so. I don't think that I'm the cause of this, because there's a limit to how much you want to give yourself credit in world situations. But if I am, then we will see a rapid de-escalation in about a month. But we'll see. I don't want to put any certainties out there. I want the politicians and the leaders to have the ability to lead instead of doing it myself. Like I've said, I prefer there to be governments instead of manually controlling everything. But long story short, we're looking at 10 years in the space age instead of 50. So that was the goal. Thank you for watching.